Well, it's no secret that the Bank of Canada is under a lot more scrutiny these days, with some people saying that their dramatically high and quick interest rate increases are making the already high cost of living in Canada even harder to deal with, while other people, including the Conservative leader, is saying that the Bank of Canada's governor should lose his job. But even more criticism could be on the way, with a shocking trend that's predicting that the Bank of Canada will lose roughly $1 billion next year and that the Canadian government could be on the hook to write the check. So let's talk about why, for the first time in history, the Bank of Canada is losing so much money and how we could be on the hook for it, as well as the magical little accounting trick that could make this all disappear. So let's dive right into it, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so to keep on getting these Canadian updates. Now, just a few weeks ago, the Bank of Canada's governor and the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada were questioned in front of Canada's Senate. Now, the Senate asked, is it true that over the next few years you could be in up to a $4 billion hole?
Your expenses are going up. So is that $4 or $5 billion figure still current? And what's going to happen to it? Like, I'd like to know, is the government going to give you the money? Is it covered by the indemnity agreement? Or I think it's going to end up in the government's bottom line anyway. But I'd just like to know how you're going to deal with it in the bank.
And Deputy Governor Carolyn Rogers gets into a lot more detail, but I need to add some context because once you understand this one simple concept, everything else is going to make a lot more sense. You might have already heard of a concept called quantitative easing, but if you haven't, don't worry, let's go into it really quickly here as a quick refresher. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Bank of Canada was worried that we'd go into a severe recession and we'd actually see deflation. So they decided to do something called quantitative easing to stimulate the economy and make sure that more people would spend more money to sort of prop up the economy. In order to do this, the Bank of Canada bought tons and tons and tons of Government of Canada bonds. You can see here before the pandemic, they had about 78, just under $80 billion worth of Government of Canada bonds. This is measured in millions. And you can see here when the pandemic hit in 2020, they reached a peak of $435 billion worth of Government of Canada bonds, roughly a 5x from where they were pre-pandemic. The Bank of Canada didn't buy this directly from the Canadian government. Instead, they bought it on the secondary market, meaning big banks, the ones that you'd be familiar with in Canada, bought these bonds directly from the government, and then the Bank of Canada bought the bonds from those banks. Now, the reason this is significant is because instead of giving these banks real money, like normal money, they instead dropped the amount that they had to pay for these bonds into the accounts that each of these banks has at the Bank of Canada, the central bank. Every big bank has an account at the Bank of Canada. So if you're following, that means that the Bank of Canada now has $350 billion worth of Government of Canada bonds, and they paid for that by putting $350 billion into the accounts of big banks, those accounts that are at the Bank of Canada. It's like the big banks have their own bank accounts that are at the Bank of Canada, right? Now, you might also know that when you hold bonds, you get paid an interest rate for holding those bonds. So while the Bank of Canada was holding these bonds, they were able to earn interest on that $350 billion worth of bonds, so they were able to make quite a lot of money. But what you might not know is that just like in your savings account where the bank has to pay you an interest rate on whatever amount of money you have in there, so does the Bank of Canada with these big banks' bank accounts at the Bank of Canada. So, okay, they're making a little bit of interest and they're paying a little bit of interest. So as long as the interest that the Bank of Canada was making was greater than the interest that it was paying to these big banks, well, then they'd be making money on the difference between the two. And this was exactly the case when this was all first going down. But if that number were to flip, and this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, if that number were to flip and now the Bank of Canada was paying more interest than it was earning on that $350 billion worth of bonds, well, then all of a sudden they start losing money instead of making it. So with that in mind, let's listen in on the Bank of Canada's response before we get into the magical accounting trick that can make all of this money just kind of disappear.
It is not a conventional balance sheet. It's not easy to understand. So over the last couple of years, our balance sheet has grown significantly. So we have more assets on our balance sheet than we normally would. Those assets are interest bearing, so they are producing some income. We also have liabilities on our balance sheet that are variable. So the losses that we're experiencing right now are sort of what we call interest rate risk. So yeah, it's a mismatch.
She describes that they're facing this interest rate risk, but what happens when the switch flips and all of a sudden the Bank of Canada is losing money instead of earning it like they were before?
We don't retain any of our income. So we don't build up a reserve to manage losses. Yeah. which is as it should be in normal times. So typically, in a typical year, we would return about $1 billion every year to the government's bottom line. In the last couple of years, as our balance sheet has grown and we've had more assets, we've turned over in excess 2.5 billion for a couple of years. So over the last few years, somewhere around close to $10 billion. Over the next 3 years, for a very temporary period of time, we will experience operating losses because of that mismatch.
So there's a lot to break down there. She starts by saying, well, over the past number of years, for a long, long time, we've been on the good side of that equation. We've been making more money on this interest than we've been losing. So in situations like that, where we have revenue, what we do is we don't keep that in a reserve fund in case we don't make revenue and actually lose money in the future. Instead, no, we give that money to the government of Canada directly. Now, she says in a typical year, this is around $1 billion worth of funds that they're giving back to the federal government. But since they started this quantitative easing program and they have way more bonds than they did before, they also made a whole bunch more money over the past few years. She says on average $2.5 billion, adding roughly a year over the past few years. And she says over the past 3 years, roughly $10 billion was given by the Bank of Canada to the government of Canada, because that's the extra money that the Bank of Canada was making, and they don't have a reserve fund. So the question is, now that the Bank of Canada is actually losing money, will the government of Canada have to turn around and give some of that money back to cover those losses? Well, Carolyn Rogers here in this next clip says, we're not the only country that's dealing with this sort of problem, and we can look to what other people have done to figure out how the heck we're going to get out of this mess.
So this is not a unique problem to the Bank of Canada. Our fellow central banks, as the governor described, the quantitative easing response to the pandemic was something most developed country, most central banks undertook. So this is something that most of our peer central banks are dealing with. They're solving it in a variety of different ways. So in some cases, the indemnity that the governments are giving them indemnity that covers operating losses. That's one way.
I saw that happen.
In the U.S., the Fed uses U.S. GAAP. So what they do is they take the operating loss, they turn it into a deferred asset, and then they run that deferred asset down over time, future earnings. And then still other central banks retain their earnings, so they have something to offset the losses. So there's a variety of different ways you can solve this.
She says there are 3 different ways that people have dealt with this in the past. The first one is indemnity, essentially the government saying, hey, we're going to cover your losses, we're going to send you this money directly. The second one is that some central banks retain earnings, like the Bank of Canada doesn't, right? When they're making money, they put a little away for when in the future they might not be making money. But the third one is something that the U.S. does specifically, and it's something special. It's creating what they're calling a deferred asset, which is kind of like an IOU, and it's an interesting accounting trick. This is a paper that was written just after the financial crisis, when the Fed, the U.S.'s central bank, the sort of equivalent of the Bank of Canada, started experimenting with money printing and quantitative easing. And I think it provides a little bit more of a good explainer here for how these deferred assets actually work. They say when a reserve bank, like the Bank of Canada or the Federal Reserve, when that income is not sufficient to cover interest expense, realized losses, operating and other expenses, a deferred asset is created. The deferred asset reflects the amount by which earnings failed to cover expenses, and as a result, the amount of future earnings that must be withheld as a result. So this is how the system works. They're going to make an asset, or sort of like an entry on their balance sheet saying, hey, this is how much we didn't make in the previous year, and we're not going to pay it back now, but we're just going to mark it down so that in the future, when we actually are making money again, if we do make money again in the future, well, we can pay that down gradually over time. But which of those 3 routes will Canada choose? Well, the whole retaining earnings thing is out of the window because the Bank of Canada has already given all the money they made in the past to the federal government, so we're left with 2, either the government of Canada bailing the Bank of Canada out, or this deferred asset example.
This is a decision ultimately for the government to make,
Right.
because it relates to our legislation.
Have they made a commitment that they're going to send you a check, or you're just going to carry those losses? Are you with the intent that in the future they'll turn around? I'm just trying to get a handle on how it's going to impact the government's bottom line, and I don't know, because if they don't give you the money for it, they're going to consolidate it. So
Yeah, I mean, they're still evaluating the different options. So
Okay.
they've looked at the different ways central banks have.
So this is something that Chrystia Freeland and her finance department at the Canadian government are going to have to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to pay the Bank of Canada directly, or are they going to tell them to use this deferred asset mechanism? There's not really precedent here in Canada. The States has been doing this for quite a while because they started their quantitative easing experimentation back just after the 2008 financial crisis, but the Bank of Canada and Canada as a country didn't need that kind of stimulus at that point. So this is kind of uncharted waters. Now, personally, I think it's most likely that they'll go with this whole deferred asset concept because, well, for a number of different reasons. Number one, it seems like we import all of our monetary policy from the States and kind of go lock in step with whatever they're doing going forward. But also, I think that the government's under certain political pressure here. If they had to give $1 billion that they could have otherwise been using for more social programs and more supports for Canadians to the Bank of Canada, something that maybe a lot of Canadians don't fully understand why they're giving that money to them, well, that could be not the greatest look, and they could get a lot of pressure both from the NDP and the Conservative Party. So I think they're probably going to go with this deferred asset thing where they can kind of make this disappear and wait until the Bank of Canada is making money again to pay this all down in the future. But I'm curious what you think about all of this. Do you think that the Bank of Canada is heading in the right direction, or do you think that there are some mistakes that have been made? Do you think they should have raised interest rates earlier so we could have avoided this interest rate tightening cycle that we're in right now? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one and I try to get back to a bunch of them. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. About half of the people who watch these videos aren't subscribed. So if you're one of those people, I appreciate you watching, but I'd also appreciate a click on that subscribe button because it helps the channel grow and brings more content to Canadians that they need. But with all of that said, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.